From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. If you're struggling with your rent and bills every month, you probably didn't need a report to know this. But it's now official. The cost of living in Toronto has become unaffordable unless you're making $83,000 a year. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives recently released a report after calculating what would be a workable rental wage, which is the hourly wage that would be required to afford rent while working a 40-hour week and spending no more than 30% of gross income on housing. It paints a bleak picture of affordability in most Canadian cities, including Toronto, showing that those trying to rent while earning minimum wage are fast losing ground. At the cost calculated, even two full-time minimum wage workers might not be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment in the city and still have enough for food and utilities. The Star's business reporter Clarrie Feinstein joins me to talk about these latest findings and how things have come to this. Hi, Clarrie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you start off by talking about this latest report that you wrote about from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives? What are some of the things that stood out for you?
Yeah, so I think the report really illustrates just how unaffordable housing is for so many Canadians and what lengths people need to go to afford a place to live. So the report really shows us that the current minimum wage in many cities, you need to be working well over 100 hours a week to afford rent. So in Toronto, for example, you need to work almost 150 hours per week if you earn $15.50 per hour. And to have what the report deems to be affordable rent, that's what you need to be working. So that number is staggering to me, and it really paints a picture of how dire the situation is for many people.
Right. That's definitely, these are like disturbing figures, like the bare minimum 150 hours a week just to make rent. You know, when I first came to Canada, I was told that it was the most practical thing to allocate 40% of your income should go towards rent, right? And in the rental market and the economy that we're seeing right now, that seems like a complete impossibility for most Canadians. What do you think?
Yeah, so nearly all Canadians putting in a 40-hour work week at minimum wage are allocating more than 30% of their monthly pre-tax income towards rent or mortgage costs, the marker of unaffordable housing, according to the report. So in 3 out of 37 cities in the report, those are the ones that are deemed affordable. In Toronto, if you make minimum wage, you can't even cover the cost of a one-bedroom apartment, which is pretty shocking.
I mean, I feel like I'm putting in 50%, but like that's just me, the way the rents are skyrocketing as well. So let's do a little bit of a comparison. How do Ontario's minimum wages compare to the rest of the country? Is it as bad elsewhere?
So it's important to put into context that this report is looking at 2022 data. So it doesn't have the most up-to-date data from 2023. So at the time of this report, Ontario had the second highest minimum wage in the country at $15.50 per hour, and BC had the highest at $15.65 per hour. But I should note that in June 1st, 2023, BC's minimum wage went up to $16.75 per hour.
I will get into how the rental markets compare across the country as well a little bit later. But when you're talking about Toronto and Ontario, for example, is this minimum wage proportionate to the cost of housing, to what we're seeing in the rental market? In Toronto, for example, like I mentioned, rents are skyrocketing. I've just seen over the past year or so, things just like changing so quickly. And for a lot of us, it's also almost become a distant dream to actually purchase a home.
Yeah, so, people are really feeling the financial pressure right now, especially in housing because of such high interest rates. So landlords' mortgages are going up drastically, and those costs are then offloaded onto the tenants, which is the reason why we're seeing drastically higher rents. So in June, rents were up almost 16% year over year in Toronto, and the average cost of a one-bedroom reached $2,527. And for a two-bedroom, it's more than $3,300, according to a report from rentals.ca. So to kind of put that into context, if you're earning minimum wage, you're making under $2,500 for the month. So right now, not only can you not afford those new rental costs, you don't even have the required money to do so.
And these average costs of rent that you brought up, these are in Toronto?
Yes, those are in Toronto.
So, what kind of income would really be needed to be able to comfortably afford rent in the city? If you can help break that cost down for us.
Yeah, so right now, in order to afford a one bedroom, minimum wage would need to double to what it is now to $33.60 per hour. And for a two bedroom, it goes up to $40 per hour. And I think it's really important to note too that that's higher than most people's take home pay. So it's not just minimum wage earners. The average hourly pay for Ontarians is between $32 to $34 per hour. So they're kind of sitting in that affordable one bedroom range, but not more than that. So I do think that's important to highlight.
Right. And then there's the other aspects of, inflation as well that they have to deal with while making rent. So, but that's an important point to highlight as well. But this is also after the Ontario government raised minimum wages, right?
Yes, that's right. So last year, the Ontario government raised minimum wage in October from 15 per hour to 15.50 per hour. And this upcoming October, it will be pushed to 16.55. So just sort of trailing a little bit behind BC.
We'll be right back. And you did a little bit of a breakdown about how steep the current rental market in Toronto, how much a one-bedroom apartment could cost in rent, and how much it's increased. Is this situation similar across Canada? Is there anywhere affordable that anybody can live within Ontario or across Canada?
Yeah, so I think what's sort of really shocking with this report is it shows that there are actually only 3 cities that are deemed affordable for one bedroom rent, and they're all in Quebec. So at the time this report was done, with that 2022 data, the hourly wage in those cities was $14.25. It's since gone up, but the cost for a one bedroom was below that minimum wage in each city. So the report really notes that affordability in Quebec, in those 3 cities, is maybe what other cities should be striving for. But kind of across the province, affordability there is also eroding because more cities in Quebec used to be in that affordable range. So it's a pretty depressing picture because sort of what was considered a haven maybe of affordable housing is no longer.
Right. So what are some of the top 3 or the top 5 most expensive cities for someone on minimum wage to try and afford rent at?
Yeah, so the top 5 cities are all based in Ontario and BC, probably not a big surprise to many people. The first is Vancouver, the second is Toronto, and then we get to Kelowna, Victoria, and Ottawa. So those are the top 5 most expensive places that you would need to make much more with your minimum wage.
And it used to be that a lot of people would say, moving out of maybe Toronto downtown core and towards the suburbs or like some of the outer regions would actually make the situation a bit more tenable. Is that still the case? Is this something that's causing people to be pushed out of downtown? And does that help?
So I think sort of the general rule applies that the further out you go from the downtown core, the more affordable housing will become. But even so, when you look kind of at the GTA as a whole, it's extremely expensive. If you want to go to Mississauga, Brampton, even parts of Caledon, it's still expensive to live there. And sort of as the report shows, is places even like Hamilton or London in Ontario, where, you're sort of seeing a bit of a population boom as people move from Toronto to those cities. Minimum wage still isn't really making the cut. So, for example, in a city like London, where the minimum wage in Ontario is $15.50 for a one bedroom, you would actually be needing to earn $21.90. So it goes to show that you still need to be earning much more than what you're making with minimum wage in many other cities in Ontario.
Right. What this continues to illustrate is that the rent continues to be disproportionate to the income that people are bringing in. And you already talked about some of the factors, but let's dwell on it a little bit more. What are the reasons that have led to this kind of untenable situation and the high cost of living? I mean, I know there was the pandemic and, things kind of worsened from there.
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of economic hardship due to the pandemic, and we're really seeing the ramifications of that. So the cost of living has soared as grocery prices remain elevated and energy costs fluctuate, and interest rates rising have also caused landlords to raise rents drastically, but minimum wage hasn't really evolved with these seismic shifts that we're seeing in our society. And a really big factor that I think is important to focus on in Ontario is that the Ford government eliminated rent control in certain circumstances in 2018. So new residential apartment buildings, condos, or houses that were occupied for the first time as of November 15th, 2018, are not rent controlled anymore. So that means that landlords can increase the rent year to year to whatever they want, and they are not required to follow any guidelines. And the report authors note that this is a huge blow to affordability in the province.
That's a really good point. What about the supply and demand rule? Is the low supply of affordable, purpose-built housing a factor as well? There's just not enough units.
Yeah, that's right. So we really need to build more purpose-built rental units, which are often more varied in size compared to condo units, which are typically quite small. And they also allow tenants to stay in the unit long term. And the GTA needs to double the construction of purpose-built rentals to 300,000 units in the next decade in order to meet demand. Yeah, it's a big number.
That's a big target, right?
Yeah.
I wonder what the impacts of something like this would be if those who are making minimum wage are kind of being pushed further and further away from the city's downtown cores to try and find affordable housing on the outskirts or even in other cities and still struggling, to be honest. And I wonder what the consequences of something like that could be.
Yeah, so, the economic impacts are significant. Because if more of your income is being taken up by housing costs, people will spend less on other expenses like eating out or entertainment or cultural activities in the city. So we'll have a blow sort of to the local economy there. And small businesses in Toronto's downtown will also struggle to find minimum wage workers who live close by because those minimum wage workers will need to live further afield and outside of the downtown. So hiring for those businesses will be an issue. But I think sort of when you look kind of bigger picture too, we could really see more pronounced class divisions in the city and bigger disparity of wealth as Toronto just becomes more and more expensive.
Right. And it obviously impacts mental health and the well-being of people who are pushed into these kinds of desperate situations, right?
Yes, of course. That's a big concern as well. And sort of just the access to services and public transit. I mean, it all sort of plays into bigger issues that we could be seeing down the road.
And this is a big question. You've already talked about one possible way to tackle this purpose-built housing and this, steep target that needs to be achieved. Is there a fix in this growing crisis? Did you talk to experts who had any ideas how to tackle this? And what role can the government play, if any?
Yeah, so the first is really to give people a livable wage. And so the report doesn't really suggest that minimum wage should be $40, for example, but notes that what we currently have isn't tenable. So the Ontario Living Wage Network says a livable wage for Toronto is around $23. So maybe that's sort of a good target for now. Another is also to ensure that there is rent control and that rents can only increase marginally. So right now, for places that do have rent control, that's typically around 2% every year that rents can go up. And that should really be the target for all rental units. And another, as I said, as we talked about, is really to push for more housing, but especially those purpose-built rentals. And that's where government really needs to step in. And as the report author said, it's really time to make housing that's affordable for Canadians instead of a for-profit asset. So that should really be the goal going forward.
Well, those are some really important points. Thank you so much for your time and your insights, Clarrie. I appreciated it a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
That was Star Business reporter Clarrie Feinstein. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Let's talk soon.